The second point in this border crossing theme is the value, even the urgent necessity, for Americans to understand and connect with other cultures and the diverse world that shapes our lives directly or indirectly. Taking a course for general education, reluctantly or not, helps to cross a cultural border, but is only the first step. To rephrase a song from the 1960s musical The King and I, about Westerners blundering around in 19th century Thailand, getting to know you may or may not result in getting to like you, but it does help to break down barriers and connect people from vastly different backgrounds. No cultures, no countries have a monopoly on values such as peace, justice, charity, tolerance, public discussion, and goodwill. Something one learns from crossing borders into other cultures and ways of thinking. All Americans can greatly benefit from this connection, from this crossing borders. Carlos Fuentes, the great Mexican writer, I think he won the Nobel Literature Prize some years back, and a frequent resident of the United States, he knows as well, wrote a few years ago that what Americans do best is understand themselves. What Americans do worst, he argued, is understand any other countries. Americans are very good at dissecting our own society, its strengths, its weaknesses. Americans, generally speaking, are poor at figuring out how other peoples think and act. Observers in other countries often perceive Americans, rightly or wrongly, as assuming that our cultural norms, political views, and economic expectations are, or should be, universal. And hence, we want to remake the world in our own image rather than trying to understand other cultures on their own terms. If you sit in Stockholm, or Cairo, or Buenos Aires, or Bombay, the world often looks very different than it does in Green Bay, or Hollywood, or New York. Which is why, as part of our required core program for majors and minors, Social Change and Development has always included a course on another region or society, giving our students some familiarity with China, or Scandinavia, or Italy, or Latin America. Americans definitely have much to be proud of, and we certainly should defend values like human rights, freedom of speech, accountable government, which we have not always done, I should note, when we allied ourselves with, and sometimes even installed, brutal dictators and corrupt regimes during the Cold War. But given our often dysfunctional electoral system, mind you of Bush v. Gore and a few other things, our economic problems, our healthcare failures, and other issues, I think Americans should be kind of modest in preaching to the world. Our leaders should be wary of talking the talk if they can't walk the walk. Misunderstanding or ignorance of other societies has been responsible for some of the many foreign policy blunders that Americans have made in the world, including the wars in Vietnam and Iraq. Countless studies have documented these misunderstandings. For example, American leaders, both civilian and military, knew very little of Vietnamese history and culture, or understood why many Vietnamese opposed the U.S. effort. As a result, Americans got bogged down in what most observers considered an unwinnable quagmire that cost many American and Vietnamese lives. Too often, American leaders were unable to see Vietnamese or Cambodians or Laotians as people with their own hopes and dreams rather than as pawns to be manipulated in geostrategic conflicts. Americans, alas, have repeated some of the same mistakes in the Middle East. When U.S. troops invaded Iraq in 2003, many of our top leaders, from the president on down, did not seem to know the differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims, a fairly basic point about Iraq, and they did not seem to know very much about how Iraqi society worked, resulting in another long and, dare I say, continuing quagmire. Fortunately, many in the American military understand the need for more awareness of other cultures and of world history. Both the U.S. Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy offer various foreign languages and now require that their students take world history. And some of the faculty there use my textbook on world history. which makes me, an old anti-war protester like me, feel real good, Actually, was even invited to give a talk at the Naval Academy a couple of years ago. The Army, needing cross-cultural expertise, has also recruited anthropologists to advise American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Several of these anthropologists have been killed doing that service. Now, these programs are controversial, and rightly so, among academics. But they do indicate the great value the military places on crossing cultural borders. Such knowledge for a soldier could be a difference between life and death, success or failure on a mission. Alas, what little foreign coverage still exists in the downsizing mainstream media, even on CNN, is more about U.S. foreign policy interests and obsessions than about the foreign countries and cultures themselves. 30 years ago, most leading U.S. newspapers, news magazines, and TV networks had full-time correspondents all over the world. I know, I used to hang out with some of these folks in Tokyo and Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur, and they were usually good for buying a beer or two. And they knew a lot about what was going on. Not now, very few foreign correspondents. Now, among the U.S. mass media, perhaps only the New York Times and National Public Radio make very much effort to examine world affairs beyond the latest crises or foreign policy challenges for the U.S. Of course, if the doomsday does come in 2012, we may get a lot of coverage of that wherever it begins. The Green Bay Press Gazette reflects this myopia. They offer one page of national and world news, and then only buried deep in the paper after pages of local and business news. Pretty pathetic, frankly. This conveys to readers that national and world news are really not very important. Of course, Americans are not the only self-absorbed nation, let's be frank. Italians are notoriously disinterested in the outside world, as my late colleague Tony Gall used to tell me. The French are, well, the French. And the Chinese still see themselves, as they have for 2,500 years, as the Middle Kingdom, surrounded by barbarians. We Americans are seen as part of that barbarian horde. But the United States, however well-intentioned, has been the 800-pound gorilla in the world for over 60 years. Our actions today, for good or ill, affect everybody else. When we sneeze, the world catches cold. That's a poor metaphor to use in this era of the swine flu. But hence, like the Great Depression of the 1930s, the 2008-2009 global recession began right here in the good old US of A, before spreading to the rest of the world. And they're not too happy about it. Iranians today, of course, still remember and resent how the US helped overthrow a popular government there in the 1950s. Chileans and Brazilians and Guatemalans, among others, have similar bitter memories of American interventions in those countries during the Cold War. Most Americans, of course, are oblivious about this history. They have no clue that any of this happened. In recent decades, the world has come to our doorstep with immigration. Even people here in Wisconsin live in communities where they encounter Asian restaurants, Latin American grocery stores, African and Caribbean musics, and foreign-owned factories. Some of my students have heard me tell that when I first moved to Green Bay in 1975, the idea of a wildly foreign meal was the Pizza Hut. Well, things have changed here in Green Bay, These newcomers and their traditions often mystify Americans. Furthermore, virtually every study in the past 2 to 3 decades shows that a large number of Americans have little knowledge of world geography and are even unable to locate on a map of the world countries where Americans have fought wars in recent years: Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Many Americans, and this is sad but true, many Americans cannot locate on a map of the world the Pacific Ocean, and quite a few can't locate the United States. This makes it harder for citizens to evaluate American foreign policies or media coverage. After one of these map knowledge studies came out, one witty observer proposed that the United States government should be prevented by law from invading or overthrowing the government of any country that a majority of adult Americans cannot locate on a map. I figured that would save a lot of money on our defense budget.